a passage from the letters and a passage from the Gospels. And I tend to preach out of the Gospels because I kind of like to stick with some guy named Jesus rather than all the other guys. But it's this one I ended up, because the passage from the Gospel is really short and it's nice, but this is a really meaty passage from Genesis. So that's the one we're going to look at. But I wanted to let you know that there are all those passages because all of the passages from the lectionary are reflected in the liturgies that I write. So I'm going to start putting the passages at the top of the page. And if you get into here before worship, you can kind of read through some of those, and then you will see those themes, and even some of the phrases that are in the liturgies are from the psalm or from one of the other passages in the lectionary that we may not read in the service itself. Okay? So just letting you know in on a little secret here. So the cup passage in the water, or the cup of water, comes from the New Testament passage. So Genesis 22, 1 through 14. This is the story of Abraham and the almost sacrifice of Isaac. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." And Abraham said, "Here I am." And God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. And on the third day Abraham looked up and saw the place far away, and Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he carried the fire and the knife, so the 2 of them walked together. And Isaac said to his father, "Father." And Abraham said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And he reached out his hand and took the knife to kill. But the Son of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." Thanks be to God for this word to us. So the setting is an interrogation room in one B movie or another. Maybe it's cops, maybe it's spies, maybe it's soldiers, it doesn't matter. But this tough-looking person looms over a person sitting at a table or sitting underneath a light. And in dread tone says, "We can do this the hard way or the easy way." Meaning, of course, tell me what I want to hear, this will all be over. Don't tell me what I want to hear, and I'm going to make sure you regret that decision. They don't right out say, if you don't tell me what I want, you're going to get tortured or abused or hurt, but of course the implication is there. Now there have been many variations on this theme. Kay Broomberg in her book Fueled has a character say, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but I will guarantee you it will be my way." And then, of course, there is everybody's favorite, SpongeBob SquarePants, who famously says, "Now, we can do this the hard way, or the easy way, or the medium way, or the medium, easy, hard way, or the sort of hard with a touch of awkward, easy, difficult, challenging way." Well, this is one of those passages that we can do the hard way or the easy way. The easy way and the popular way is to take this rather odd story of God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, a child whom God himself has given, right, to Abraham and Isaac miraculously, or to Abraham and Sarah miraculously, and make it a simple matter of God testing Abraham's faith. And that is, of course, the simple front message that's out there in the Scriptures. And I'm sure that you have all heard this passage talked about that way. I am sure that in the past, I myself have talked about this passage that way. We all know how the easy formula goes. God asked Abraham to do a dreadful thing, kill his child. Abraham takes this miraculous child up onto the mountain and begins to do that. Suddenly God appears, substitutes a ram, bam, God satisfied. Abraham vindicated, child saved, faith triumphant. It's a great story, right? The idea that God tests people, sometimes bizarre ways and sometimes extreme ways, is an interesting one. It's a concept we're all familiar with. In fact, I would guess that many of us have had that idea presented to us, taught to us many, many times in the church. Because it's an easy way to explain why, if God is in absolute control of absolutely everything, bad things, difficult things happen in this world. Bad things, difficult things happen to good people. It's a test. And then we can let go of it. And God doesn't have to be held accountable in any way, and we don't have to be held accountable in any way. It's a test to make sure that there is faith, to make sure that there is enough faith. It seems simple enough. Rick Warren, who's a rather famous church kind of guy, on his blog page, a page called Daily Hope, provides us with this classic solution. He starts by writing in this blog, the Bible repeatedly says that God has promised to meet your needs. And that is one of the texts in this passage, isn't it? God has promised. The Bible repeatedly says that God has promised to meet your needs. And then there's a quote, and my God will meet all of your needs according to the riches of his glory. That's from Philippians. But then he continues, but the Bible also tells us that with every promise there is a condition. I'm not so sure now. In fact, it appears there's more than one condition, because he says one of the conditions for this promise is that you have to trust God. Now, that's not a totally wrong statement. I actually agree with that up to a point. But here's how it goes. The more you trust God, the more God is able to meet needs in your life. So how do you learn to trust God more so that God can meet all of your needs? You see why I'm having a little trouble here? How can you learn to have greater faith? Faith is like a muscle. It develops by being used. The more you use your faith, the more it gets stretched. The more it gets stretched, the more God blesses your life. We call the circumstance that God creates to stretch our faith trials. These trials show that faith is genuine. And then he quotes Peter. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. So what Warren is saying here, and I think this is actually pretty typical theology that gets thrown out there a lot, is that God is going to be nice to you. God is going to give you good things. God is going to meet your needs, but the blessings of God are conditional. And you have to pass tests. And the more you pass tests, the more proven you are, the more you get. So here's the formula. God puts struggles in your path. God puts difficult people in your path. God puts things in your path that don't seem to resolve. We know how that goes, right? Your back doesn't get better. Your house doesn't get painted. God puts temptations in front of you, all kinds of competing priorities in your life. Those things test your faith. Those things test your love for God. Those things test your willingness to put God first. It's a test. And whether or not good things then emerge in your life depends upon whether you pass the test. This is not exactly grace alone here. And almost every commentary that talks about this passage goes that direction. And some of the writers frame this to make it work in some really interesting, almost crazy ways. This was my favorite unfavorite, if that makes any sense. As Isaac grew up, God sensed a problem was developing. God became nervous. Sorry, I can't picture God in heaven wringing his hands and getting nervous. God became nervous. God sensed that Father Abraham and Mother Sarah were more preoccupied with Isaac rather than God himself. God sensed that this little bundle of pleasure had become the center of their lives instead of the Lord himself. The aging parent's fascination was the child rather than the Lord and the ways of the Lord, so God decided to put Abraham to the test. Now, what I read in that is Abraham was tested because he loved his kid. And God was jealous of this father's love for his child. I have a problem with that. I'm sorry. So Abraham is asked to kill the kid, kill the son. Now, this is a heck of a test of faith. I have a son. I cannot imagine, right, being asked to do that. Can you imagine being asked to do that? Can any of you have children imagine being asked to kill any of your children? But Abraham, of course, in this story, goes along with it. He prepares for the sacrifice. He keeps saying God will provide. He goes so far as to take knife in hand, literally has his child bound, lying on top of the wood, knife in hand, ready to strike before God intervenes. Now, all who make the story simple, who go the easy way, go, aha, see? God provided. Yea, Abraham, he had faith. Yea, God, he provided. And because Abraham is willing to do the hard, impossible thing, because God asked for it, he is blessed and he becomes the father of the family of God. That's the easy solution to this passage. But I'm not so sure it's that easy. Because I think that with the easy way, number one, we end up having a problem with God, or at least I do, because the image of God in this passage bothers me, to be really honest. Or perhaps it's better to say we have a problem God. For God to ask a father to sacrifice son on the altar sounds really barbaric and primitive, and even cultic to me. And in fact, if you think back to the time that this story took place, it's in Canaan, way back, guess what the Canaanites did? They had child sacrifice. Okay? So that's the culture this is set in. Now the question is this. What kind of God asks the father to sacrifice the son? Does the God revealed in Jesus? Now, of course, there is a view of God that has God, not humans, putting Jesus on the cross. So perhaps there is that carry forward, right? That God does sacrifice sons. And so maybe that works, maybe this story works for some. But for me, the question remains, is this who God is? Is this how God acts? Is God so jealous that God can't stand parents loving their children? Is God one who sacrifices children? If so, this is where I went. God reminds me of all those abusive, all those addicted parents who out there who keep their children guessing, who put strings on their love, who in fact damage their children by their behavior, by their demands, by their inconsistency. I cannot tell you what percentage of people who came in to see me over the years at the Center for Wellness who had parents like this. But I can tell you that was a lot of them. What did this do to Abraham? That God asked him to kill his child. What happened to the relationship between Abraham and Yahweh, even though it had this outcome? Personally, I can imagine that Abraham ended up kind of looking over his shoulder the rest of his life, fearing what God was going to ask for next, and wondering if next time either he might not be enough or God might not interrupt. That's not a very comfortable relationship. And what ultimately did it do to Isaac? To know that his father, for the sake of God, was willing to pick up a knife and kill him. Wow. And honestly, it's kind of ridiculous that Abraham was being tested this way in the first place. If you think about the whole story of Abraham, it goes way back, 10 chapters in Genesis, back to chapter 12 is where it starts. Abraham's family is living in a town called Haran, which is in what we now know as Turkey. Originally, they lived in Ur of the Chaldees, which was down in what would be southern Iraq on the Euphrates River. But they'd come up and they lived in this town called Haran. Now, Abraham's brother's name was Haran, and the town was named Haran. And places, site names in those days, often took the names took on the names of the royal family that was kind of the leading family in the city. So there's a really good chance here that Abraham and his family were a royal family, essentially. They were the rulers of this city-state called Haran. But either way, we know that Abraham's family was well off. We know that Abraham himself had a very, very good life going. So what does God do? God, according to Genesis, comes to Abraham and says to him, I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave your home, your homeland, your town, your flocks, your fields, your security. I want you to do all of that, and I want you to go south. And when Abraham asked him where south, God answers simply, to the place that I send you. I can imagine Abraham going, and where are you sending me? South. Where south? South. Not, how much trust does it take, right? To leave a place of safety, comfort, affluence, and go south into the desert with no destination, right? No GPS, no nothing, just south. That was a huge step of faith, and Abraham does it. Takes a lot of trust, and he does it. Now, as he heads south, God promises some things, right? Promises him he will be the father of a great family. Promises him a land, that he will be the father of a populous nation as numerous as the stars. Promises them that family will be in the promised land flowing with milk and honey. And then he promises ultimately that he will never be alone. God will always be with him, always on his side. Very cool. Very cool. So Abraham goes south. And he does, as far as we know, all the right things. But God doesn't really come through very well. He really doesn't. After Abraham's leap of faith, year after year after year after year pass, and there's no child. Right? There's no child. Sarah, we are told, is barren. Yeah, there we go, another test. Fun. And there's no land. At the time the story happens, Abraham and his family are still nomads. They don't have a land. They don't have a home. They're wandering around camping. Another test. And as to presents, well, we've got a God hanging around who asks you to kill your kid. So God's not doing very well here, actually. So this story has some hard angles. Now, if you grew up in the church, you've heard this story. I've heard it from infancy, right? And the focus is always on the promises of God. God promised, God delivered, God promised, God delivered. But it wasn't that clean. Abraham barely became the father of a nation. He had one child, eventually, miraculously, when he's 80 years old. Good grief. Never did get to occupy the promised land. He bought some caves outside of Hebron so that he could be buried on this land that eventually maybe possibly would be his and his family's. But that's all he got there. And presence, yeah, God was always there. He was. But honestly, the relationship was complicated. So this story raises a lot of questions about God, about the way God works, about what God offers. And in this story, God's a little iffy. And some would say he might even be arbitrary and cruel. And the question is, how do we reconcile this God in this story with the God who spoke and created the world, with the God who gave Isaiah the image of the peaceful kingdom, with the God who calls for social and economic justice through the minor prophets, with the God who came as a baby, with the God who lived in Jesus Christ, with the God who died on the cross? How do we put those two together? So this is a story that actually is not easy when it comes to how we think about God. And it's not easy either when it comes to the issue of faith, to the nature of faith. What does faith demand? Does God ask us to do ugly things? For the people of Israel, child sacrifice, something practiced by the Canaanites, was absolutely, positively prohibited. This was not something you did, period. You just didn't do it. But Abraham is asked, so we are told, to do the unthinkable, something that is actually prescribed against in the faith system. Did God ask it? Does God ask us to do things that are ugly? Does God ask us to reject other people? Does God ask us to exclude? Does God ask us to kill? And if God does, what is the impact of having a God, a holy parent like that? I know what demanding parents who are unpredictable, unrelenting, and cruel, I know what they do to kids. We call it ACEs, adverse childhood events. They mess kids up totally for the rest of their lives. I know what that happens when that happens. It creates kids who live in fear. It creates kids who look over their shoulder, who are afraid they will fail and be rejected, who constantly need to prove themselves, who constantly think, I am not enough, I am never enough, and will do anything to get approval. So what does it do to us in terms of how we see ourselves, in terms of how we respond to others to have a God like this? Do we find ourselves unsure of our value, our worth? Questioning whether we're enough? Does it leave us looking over our shoulders, worrying about what God's thinking, what God's going to do, what God's going to ask, feeling like we constantly have to prove ourselves to God? I will tell you, many, many people I talk to show me by what they say, and often sometimes by what they do, that they are not sure that God approves of them. That they have to prove themselves to God or something bad's going to happen. People feel like they have to do something for God. They have to do certain things in order to really have their faith affirmed. And in some cases we know it goes so far as for people to think that they have to do something horrible for God. They have to do something as horrible as raise a hand with a knife in it, ready to slash down and kill a child. They must do something as horrible as strap a bomb around their middle and walk into the midst of innocents. They have to do something as horrible as to walk into a black church with a rifle. A friend of mine once talked about the terrible power of faith. And he was talking about faith that is not really faith. A faith that must do the spectacular, a faith that must do something extreme, a faith that must prove itself. If you have to prove yourself to God, then you aren't trusting, are you? The faith of Abraham, hand raised, knife in hand. The faith of terrorists, the faith of people who, in order to prove that they have enough faith, do horrible things and do things like reject and exclude and judge and coerce and minimize and hate. That's not faith, that's fear. That's not faith, that's fear. So here's the bottom line for me. I am so thankful for Jesus. I'm so thankful that Jesus showed us what God is really like. I am so thankful that Jesus showed us that God is a good parent, a kind parent, a loving parent, a forgiving parent, a parent who never gives up on anybody. We can have faith in a God like that. A faith that frees us. A faith that frees us to accept ourselves, to accept others. A faith that frees us to listen and care and help and share and be open and not have to be angry and fearful and violent. I'm thankful that Jesus shows us what faith really looks like and what God really looks like. And enables us to trust that God is really love, really is love. And I'm thankful that Jesus shows us that because we can have faith in that kind of a God, we can say no to what is cruel. We can say no to what is ugly. We can say no to fear. And we can be free to love. Let's pray. Almighty God, we thank you for this story, which is a tough story. I kind of liked it easier, Lord, when I was a kid, and I could just take it at face value. But it is a difficult story, but it is a rich story which reminds us of so much that is good and positive about who you are and who we are when we are your children. I am thankful, Lord, for Abraham. I'm thankful for these stories from the Old Testament, which are amazing and tell us so much about how complicated it is to be your children. But I'm also so very thankful for the story, which is Jesus, and for the difference that story makes. Thank you for all of this. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.